All right, so we are going to continue our conversation about biogeochemical cycles by talking about the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles today. So you'll remember that yesterday we talked about the carbon cycle as one of these biogeochemical cycles. And so we're going to continue this conversation by talking about the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle. So first, let's talk a little bit about nitrogen. So nitrogen is an element. It's an essential constituent of protein, DNA, RNA, chlorophyll, lots of vitally important organic compounds. It is also the most abundant gas in the atmosphere, but the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere is not available to be used by plants or other organisms. It has to be fixed or converted into a usable form. So let's talk about this nitrogen cycle. So in the atmosphere, we have both N2, which is nitrogen gas. We also have nitrogen oxide compounds. So there's a process called fixation, where nitrogen fixing soil bacteria take nitrogen from the atmosphere that enters the soil through precipitation, and they transform it into NH3, which is ammonia. That then transforms into NH4+, which is the ammonium ion, and that goes through another step. There's another way that nitrogen can be transformed into ammonia or ammonium, and that process is called ammonification. Ammonification is the process of decomposition, either of animal waste or of dead organic material. So it breaks down the dead organic material and it transforms the nitrogen from whatever form it might be in into ammonia or ammonium. So nitrogen fixation is the process of taking atmospheric nitrogen gas and transforming it into ammonia. Ammonification is the process where decomposers transform nitrogen-containing compounds into ammonia. Okay, so the next step, once we have the ammonia or the ammonium ion, is a process called nitrification. And nitrification is performed by nitrifying bacteria. They use oxygen in the soil to transform that ammonia or ammonium into nitrates and nitrites. Now the nitrogen is in a form that plants and other primary producers can take up and use to build their own building blocks. And that process, the uptake of these nitrates and nitrites, is called assimilation. The final piece of the nitrogen cycle is something called denitrification. So denitrification is where denitrifying bacteria transform nitrates and nitrites back into atmospheric nitrogen gas, so gaseous nitrogen. This process normally takes place in oxygen poor soils, so these would be waterlogged soils. So fixation, we said, starts with nitrogen in the atmosphere, enters the soil through precipitation, is fixed by bacteria or algae that convert to ammonium. This frequently is symbiotic bacteria with the roots of plants. There is also an artificial fixation process where nitrogen can be transformed into ammonia, and that's where our synthetic fertilizers come from. Ammonification, we said, takes nitrogen from living things, and those decomposers convert those different forms of nitrogen to ammonia. Nitrification is the process of taking ammonia in the soil from those nitrogen-fixing bacteria or from decomposition and converting it to nitrates or nitrites. And it's now in a form that can be used by producers. Denitrification takes nitrates and nitrites in the soil, and those denitrifying bacteria convert the nitrites and nitrates to nitrogen gas. And again, that occurs in oxygen poor conditions. Now that nitrogen is no longer available to producers. Okay, so that's our nitrogen cycle. Let's move on to the phosphorus cycle. So a few facts about phosphorus before we get started. Phosphorus is a component of DNA and RNA along with ATP and ADP, which you might remember from your biology classes. It's also a critical component of both proteins and enzymes. which are proteins. Phosphorus is a great example of how a mineral element becomes part of an organism. The source of phosphorus is rock. Phosphorus is soluble in water, slightly soluble in water, as phosphate ions, but generally speaking is pretty insoluble. And phosphorus is usually the limiting reactant for producers in an ecosystem, or limiting nutrient. All right, let's talk about this cycle. So the phosphorus cycle is a sedimentary cycle. It's not a transformational cycle like the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle. Phosphorus comes from rocks. It is released into this cycle through erosion, weathering, or mining. It is taken up by plant roots and then it travels through the food chains, which means that it returns to the soil through decomposition. It can be lost from the soil through leaching. The phosphorus cycle, unlike the carbon cycle, water cycle, and nitrogen cycle, does not have a gaseous component. Because this is a sedimentary cycle and because rock is involved, the turnover rate of the phosphorus cycle is very, very slow. So here's our cycle. Precipitation weathers rocks. That causes runoff of these phosphorus-containing compounds, usually phosphates. If that runoff makes it into the soil, then plants can uptake those phosphate ions. They are then consumed and through decomposition can re-enter the soil. It can also leach out of the soil where it can enter the water and be taken up by producers in the water. It will also, because it is only very slightly soluble, will eventually join sediment on the bottom of the river, lake, or ocean. And then it re-enters the rocks through geologic uplift. So that's it. We have building blocks of life: water, nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus, and sulfur. So far we've talked about 3 of these cycles: the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. So next we'll take on the water cycle.